Welcome back and enjoy the story. The rain hammered against the windshield of Mrs. Helen Turner's aging Chevrolet as she sat motionless in the school parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Through the glass she could see students rushing past, backpacks pulled over their heads, teenagers laughing despite the downpour. She watched them with hollow eyes, remembering how for 35 years she had been the one to greet them each morning, to guide them through their struggles, to believe in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. Now, at 63, she was nothing more than yesterday's news. Principal Warren's words echoed in her mind like a cruel mantra. We need fresh faces, younger energy. The board has decided to go in a different direction. No thank you for decades of service. No acknowledgement of the countless lives she'd touched. Just a pink slip and a security guard waiting to escort her from the building. Helen turned the key and drove home slowly through the rain-soaked streets of Chicago, each turn feeling like another step toward an uncertain future. Her modest apartment on the north side welcomed her with familiar silence, a small space she'd called home for 20 years, where she lived alone with her books, her memories, and a cat named Dickens who'd stopped jumping onto her lap years. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the cardboard box containing 35 years of her professional life. Lesson plans, thank you notes from students, photos from countless school events, all reduced to a container small enough to fit on a shelf. She pulled out a faded note written in crayon. Mrs. Turner, you are the best techer in the whole world. Love, Tommy. She couldn't even remember his last name anymore, but she remembered his shy smile and how he'd struggled with reading until she'd worked with him every afternoon for months. The next morning brought no relief. Helen woke to find an email from Human Resources informing her that her health insurance would terminate at the end of the month. Another message from Principal Warren reminded her to return her school keys immediately. The bureaucratic coldness of it all felt like salt in an already deep wound. She dressed carefully that day, as if maintaining her dignity through appearance could somehow make her feel less discarded. In her navy blue blazer and sensible shoes, she looked every inch the dedicated educator she'd always been. But as she walked through the hallways one last time, her head held high despite everything, she felt the whispers following her like shadows. Did you hear? They fired Helen Turner. Just like that. After all those years, shame, really. The worst part wasn't the loss of her job, it was the loss of purpose. Helen had never married, never had children of her own. Her students had been her legacy, her reason for getting up each morning. Now, at an age when most people were enjoying retirement, she faced the terrifying prospect of starting over with nothing but a meager pension and a reputation that felt tarnished by her sudden dismissal. Principal Warren seemed almost pleased with himself as he walked the halls that morning, already interviewing candidates for Helen's replacement. He was a man in his 40s who'd arrived at the school 3 years ago with grand plans for modernization and efficiency. To him, Helen represented the old guard, a relic of outdated teaching methods that needed to be swept away to make room for progress. But life has a way of delivering surprises when we least expect them. As Warren sipped his morning coffee and reviewed applications for young, dynamic teachers, he had no idea that the universe was about to remind him that every action has consequences. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, but this time they carried more than just rain. They carried a reckoning that would transform everything, not just for Helen Turner, but for everyone whose life she had touched over the decades. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, like the gentle hand of a teacher guiding a struggling student, and sometimes it arrives with the thunderous power of a debt finally being repaid. The morning after her dismissal, Helen sat by her window watching the city wake up beneath a grey sky. She thought about Tommy and all the other students she'd helped over the years. Where were they now? Did they remember the woman who'd believed in them when no one else would? She was about to discover that memories, like seeds planted long ago, sometimes bloom when we need them most. As she prepared to face another day of uncertainty, Helen had no way of knowing that across the city, in a gleaming office tower, someone was preparing to repay a debt 30 years in the making. Someone who remembered not just her name, but how she'd saved his life when he was just a scared, angry boy who everyone else had given up on. The sound of a helicopter's rotors would soon shatter the morning quiet, bringing with it a reminder that sometimes the past and present collide in the most unexpected ways. Helen Turner's story was far from over. In fact, it was about to begin its most remarkable chapter. Have you ever experienced or known someone who has experienced being fired after decades of loyal service? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Deep in the poorest neighborhood of Chicago's South Side, there lived a 17-year-old boy who seemed destined for failure. Elijah Washington, he would change his name to Mason years later, was everything a guidance counselor might mark as at risk, angry, poor, academically struggling, and carrying the weight of a father who'd abandoned his family when Elijah was 12. His mother, Sarah, worked double shifts at a downtown hotel, cleaning rooms and scrubbing floors until her hands bled, trying to keep their tiny apartment and put food on the table. Elijah rarely saw her awake. When he did, she was usually too exhausted to do more than give him a tired smile and ask if he'd eaten. School was Elijah's battleground. He'd arrive late, sit in the back of every classroom, and radiate the kind of hostility that made teachers uncomfortable. Most of them had given up on him by November of his junior year. They'd seen his test scores, noted his frequent absences, and filed him away in their minds as another casualty of the system. But Helen Turner saw something different. She noticed how his eyes followed her as she explained algebraic concepts, how he'd lean forward slightly when she read poetry aloud, how his fist would clench when other students mocked him for his worn sneakers or patched jacket. She saw a boy fighting a war on multiple fronts, against poverty, against despair, against a world that seemed determined to prove he didn't matter. "Elijah," she said one day after class, "I need help organizing the supply closet. Could you stay for a few minutes?" It wasn't true. The closet was perfectly organized, but she'd noticed he often went without lunch, and there happened to be sandwiches left over from a teacher meeting. He was suspicious at first, certain it was another adult trap designed to humiliate him. But Helen's gentle persistence wore down his defenses. Soon, those after-school sessions became routine. She'd tutor him in math, help him with essays, and slowly, carefully, begin to piece together the broken parts of his confidence. "You're smart," she told him one afternoon as they worked through a particularly difficult problem. "You just think in different ways than some people," he scoffed. "Smart kids don't get their lights shut off or eat cereal for dinner. Smart kids sometimes have to deal with things that have nothing to do with their intelligence," she replied firmly. "Your circumstances don't define your potential." But Helen's kindness toward Elijah didn't go unnoticed by everyone. Some colleagues questioned her methods, wondering why she spent so much time on that Washington boy, when there were other students who seemed more worth the effort. The administration began to take notice too, especially when Elijah's grades started improving dramatically. "You're wasting your time," another teacher warned Helen during lunch one day. "Kids like him don't change. He'll drop out before graduation, mark my words." Helen felt the weight of institutional skepticism, but she'd made a promise to herself and to Elijah. She wouldn't give up. Not when she could see the brilliant mind hiding behind layers of hurt and anger. Not when she'd witnessed him calculating probabilities in his head while playing cards during lunch, or seen him write poetry in the margins of his homework that rivaled published works. The tension at Lincoln High School grew. Other teachers began to resent the time and attention Helen gave to Elijah. Parents of honor students complained that their children weren't receiving the same level of support. The whispers in the faculty lounge became louder, more pointed. "She's playing favorites" became a common refrain. "What makes that boy so special?" But Helen knew what they couldn't see. She understood that sometimes one person's belief can change everything. She'd seen it before, though never quite as dramatically as with Elijah. He was transforming, not just academically, but personally. The anger was still there, but it was being channeled into determination. One evening, as Helen was packing up her classroom, Elijah appeared in her doorway. "Mrs. Turner," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me when everyone else looked through me." She smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made a difference. "You did the work, Elijah. I just provided the space for you to grow." Unknown to both of them, this conversation was being overheard by Principal Adams, Helen's boss at the time, and a man very different from Warren. Adams had been watching Helen's work with Elijah with growing admiration. Here was teaching at its finest, not just imparting knowledge but transforming lives. But change is never easy, and both Helen and Elijah were about to face their greatest challenges yet. Forces were aligning that would test everything they'd built together and prove whether the bond between teacher and student could survive the pressures of a world that often rewards cynicism over hope. The spring semester brought new obstacles that neither Helen nor Elijah had anticipated. A budget crisis hit the school district and programs were being cut left and right. The after-school tutoring that had been Helen's refuge with struggling students was eliminated. Worse, there were whispers about staff reductions, last hired, first fired, and some long-term teachers with higher salaries might be let go to make room for cheaper alternatives. Helen felt the walls closing in from all sides. Without the official tutoring program, she had to find new ways to help Elijah, who was now scoring in the top 10% of his class, but still needed support to stay on track. She began opening her classroom early in the morning and staying late, unofficial sessions that she hoped administration wouldn't notice. But they did notice. Principal Adams called her into his office on a grey Tuesday morning. "Helen," he said, his face grave, "we need to talk." Her heart sank. "Is this about Elijah Washington?" "Partly." He leaned back in his chair. "I've been getting complaints. Some parents think you're giving preferential treatment. Some teachers think you're making them look bad. And the district office is asking questions about your unorthodox methods." "My methods are producing results," Helen said firmly. "Elijah's grades." "I know about Elijah's grades. I also know about his background. What you've done for that boy is remarkable." Adams rubbed his temples. "But I'm under pressure. The board meets next week, and your name is on the agenda." Helen felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that sometimes doing the right thing isn't enough. Sometimes politics and perception matter more than results." He looked at her with genuine sadness. "I'm sorry, Helen. I really am." That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She walked the streets of her neighborhood, eventually finding herself at a 24-hour diner, where she sat with a cup of coffee that grew cold as she stared out at the empty street. Tomorrow, she would face a board meeting that could end her career. All for believing in a boy that others had written off. Meanwhile, Elijah was dealing with his own crisis. His mother had been hospitalized with pneumonia, and the medical bills were mounting. He'd taken a part-time job at a gas station, working nights and barely staying awake in class. The perfect storm of circumstances threatened to destroy everything he and Helen had worked for. "I can't do this anymore," he told Helen after yet another sleepless night. "I need to drop out, get a full-time job." "You're 3 months from graduation," Helen said, her voice steady despite her own fears. 3 months from scholarship applications. You can't give up now." "I can't let my mom lose our apartment." Helen understood. She also understood that this was exactly the kind of situation that derailed promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds. But she wasn't about to let it happen. Not to Elijah, not on her watch. "Let me help," she said. "You're already in enough trouble because of me." She smiled sadly. "Maybe, but you know what? I'd rather be in trouble for fighting for what's right than be comfortable staying silent." The board meeting loomed ahead, a potential catastrophe that could destroy both their futures. But Helen had spent 30 years learning that sometimes the biggest risks led to the most important victories. As she prepared for what might be her final stand as an educator, she felt something she hadn't expected: peace. She'd fought the good fight. Whatever happened next, she could live with the consequences. But what neither Helen nor Elijah knew was that someone else was watching their struggle from the shadows, someone who remembered being young and hopeless, and having only one person believe in them. Someone who now had the power to change everything. The dominoes were falling, each one setting the stage for a confrontation that would define both their futures. And in the end, it would prove that sometimes the very things that threaten to destroy us become the catalysts for our greatest triumphs. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. But Tuesday brought an unexpected twist that changed everything. Helen arrived at school to find a letter on her desk, not from the administration, but from the University of Chicago. "Congratulations," it read. "Elijah Washington has been selected as one of our newest scholarship recipients, with full tuition and living expenses covered. This decision was based on his dramatic academic improvement and the strong recommendation from his teacher, Mrs. Helen Turner." Helen's hands shook as she read it again. Somehow Elijah had applied for scholarships without telling her, and he'd gotten a full ride to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. The boy who'd been written off as hopeless was going to college. She found Elijah in the library during lunch, hunched over a calculus textbook. When she showed him the letter, his face went through a dozen emotions before settling on disbelief. "This is real?" he asked. "It's real." For the first time since she'd known him, Elijah Washington cried. Not from sadness or anger or frustration, but from pure, overwhelming relief. "I can't believe it," he whispered. "I'm going to college." "You earned it," Helen said, feeling her own tears threatening to fall. "Every single day, every late night, every time you wanted to give up but didn't, you earned this." Word spread quickly through the school. The boy from the South, Side, who'd been labeled a lost cause, was heading to the University of Chicago. It was the kind of story that local news outlets loved. The underdog who made good, the teacher who never gave up, the triumph of determination over circumstance. But with the good news came unexpected complications. Principal Warren, who'd recently been promoted to replace the retiring Adams, wasn't pleased with the attention Helen was receiving. The local papers had written articles about the teacher who changes lives, and parents were requesting specifically that their children be placed in her classes. "This kind of favoritism can't continue," Warren told Helen in a private meeting. "You've created unrealistic expectations. Not every student needs or deserves the kind of intensive attention you gave Washington." "Every student deserves to be seen and believed in," Helen replied. "That's idealistic thinking," Warren said dismissively. "We're here to educate, not to save people." The philosophical divide between them was clear. Warren represented efficiency, standardization, test scores. Helen represented individual attention, relationship building, the belief that every child mattered. The tension was building toward something that felt inevitable. Meanwhile, Elijah was preparing for graduation and college, but he was also planning something else. He'd spent hours in the school computer lab, researching and writing. The night before graduation, he presented Helen with a bound manuscript. "What's this?" she asked. "It's my story," he said. "Our story. What you did for me. I want people to know." Helen opened to the dedication page. "To Mrs. Helen Turner, who saw light where others saw only shadow. This is your story as much as mine." As she read, Helen understood that Elijah had captured something profound. Not just his own transformation, but the power of one person's refusal to give up on another. It was brilliant, moving, and honest in a way that took her breath away. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" she asked. "Not yet, but I want to." Graduation day arrived with pomp and ceremony. Principal Warren gave the opening remarks, talking about excellence and achievement. But when Elijah took the stage as valedictorian, another surprise, his grades had placed him first in the class, his speech was different from the usual. Fair. He spoke about failure and second chances, about teachers who see potential when others see problems, about the power of refusing to accept limitations. And as he spoke, his eyes kept finding Helen in the audience, this woman who'd changed the trajectory of his life simply by believing in him. "Mrs. Turner," he said toward the end of his speech, "if you're watching, I want you to know, I'm just getting started. This isn't the end of our story, it's the beginning." The crowd erupted in applause, but Helen barely heard it. She was thinking about the boy she'd met 3 years ago, angry and hopeless, and the young man he'd become. She was thinking about the board meeting she'd survived, the colleagues who doubted her methods, and the principal who still questioned her approach. What she couldn't know, as she sat in that auditorium feeling proud and nostalgic, was that Elijah's words were more prophetic than anyone realized. Their story wasn't ending. It was transforming into something bigger than either of them could imagine. because sometimes when you plant seeds of kindness in good soil, they grow into forests. And sometimes those forests shelter entire generations. 30 years passed. Helen continued teaching at Lincoln High School, weathering changes in administration, curriculum, and educational philosophy. She became something of a legend, the teacher who'd helped transform Elijah Washington from a struggling teenager into one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. Elijah, who'd legally changed his last name to Mason as a young adult, choosing the name of the stonemasons who'd built the university that gave him his start, kept in touch with Helen for the first few years after graduation. Letters then, emails, sharing his progress through college, graduate school, his first business ventures, his failures and successes. But as his company, Mason Tech, grew from a small startup to a multinational corporation, the correspondence became less frequent. Helen understood. Life moves fast for successful people, and the past, no matter how meaningful, can seem increasingly distant. She followed his career from a distance, reading articles in newspapers and magazines about the business visionary from Chicago's South Side and the tech billionaire with humble beginnings. She felt proud, the way a parent feels watching. Their children achieve great things, but also a little sad. She wondered if he remembered the woman who'd first seen his potential. In her mid-50s, Helen faced her own share of challenges. She'd never married, never had children of her own, choosing instead to dedicate her life to her students. As she aged, she sometimes wondered if she'd made the right choice. Her small apartment felt smaller each year, and retirement seemed simultaneously too distant and too close. The new generation of teachers was different, younger, more focused on technology, less inclined toward the kind of intensive individual mentoring that had defined Helen's career. Principal Warren, still in charge, after all these years, made it clear that Helen's old-fashioned methods were increasingly out of step with modern education. "Times change, Helen," he reminded her regularly. "We need efficiency now, data-driven results. You can't spend all your time on a few special cases anymore." Helen adapted as best she could, but she never stopped believing in the power of personal connection. She continued to arrive early and stay late, helping students who reminded her of Elijah, the ones others were ready to abandon. At 63, she was one of the oldest teachers still in the classroom. Younger teachers treated her with polite respect, but she could see it in their eyes. They thought she was outdated, a relic of a different era in education. The school had installed smart boards and tablets, emphasizing STEM education and college prep programs that seemed to leave little room for the kind of individual attention Helen knew could change lives. One afternoon, grading papers in her empty classroom, Helen found herself thinking about Elijah more than usual. She'd seen his name in the news recently, something about a major philanthropic initiative. She wondered what he was like now, whether success had changed him, whether he ever thought about the teacher who'd believed in him when no one else would. She was about to discover that some connections transcend time and distance. That gratitude can lie dormant for decades before blooming into something magnificent. And that sometimes the seeds we plant in youth grow into the very protection we need in our later years. The next morning would bring changes she couldn't imagine. The morning after that would bring a reckoning that would transform not just her life, but everything she thought she knew about the impact teachers have on the world. Because Elijah Mason had never forgotten Helen Turner, he'd been waiting for the right moment to repay the debt he owed her. And now, finally, that moment had arrived. The morning of Helen's firing arrived with cruel efficiency. She was called to Principal Warren's office between third and fourth period, assuming it was another mundane administrative meeting. The secretary wouldn't meet her eyes as she knocked on the door. "Come in," Warren's voice called. Helen entered, to find not just Warren, but two members of the school board and someone from Human Resources. Her stomach clenched. This wasn't a routine meeting. "Please sit," Warren said, gesturing to a chair facing his desk. He looked almost pleased, wearing the expression of someone about to solve a long-standing problem. "We're letting you go, effective immediately," Warren said without preamble. "Budget constraints require us to reduce our most expensive staff members. Your position will be filled by someone more cost-effective." Helen felt the world tilt. I'm sorry. What? We need younger faces, fresher perspectives. The education landscape is changing, and frankly, you haven't kept up. The board member nodded. 35 years is a good run. You should be proud. Should be proud, as if her entire career was just a participation trophy. My students, Helen began. Will be fine, Warren interrupted. Mrs. Peterson will finish the semester with your classes. Mrs. Peterson, Helen thought dimly. A first-year teacher who'd barely managed classroom control and complained constantly about the difficult students. They handed her paperwork. Severance Cobra information. A security guard appeared at the door to escort her to clear out her classroom. The hallways felt surreal as she walked past doors, where she'd taught thousands of students, past bulletin boards she'd decorated, past colleagues who quickly looked away. Her classroom, her professional home for the past 15 years, felt like a museum of a life that was suddenly over. Awards from students, photos from decades of graduations, cards from grateful parents. The security guard cleared his throat impatiently as she packed 35 years into 2 cardboard boxes. Other teachers peeked in as she worked, their faces masks of sympathy and fear. If they could fire Helen Turner, the most dedicated teacher in the school, who was safe? The rain that had been threatening all morning finally broke as Helen loaded her boxes into her aging car. By the time she reached home, she was soaked through, her hair plastered to her head, her dignity somewhere in the gutter with the rain. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the termination papers. The practical side of her mind catalogued the problems. Health insurance ending in 30 days, inadequate retirement savings, a job market that favored candidates 30 years younger. But it was the cruelty that hurt most. No ceremony, no acknowledgement, no thank you for dedicating her life to the school. Just a cold dismissal by a man who'd once asked her advice about handling difficult parents, who'd praised her results, when they made the school look good. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by her window watching the city lights blur through her tears, wondering what she'd done to deserve such humiliation. At 63, she was too young for retirement, but too old to start over. She felt invisible, discarded, forgotten. The next morning, she forced herself to get dressed, to maintain some semblance of dignity. But as she sat with her coffee, scrolling through job sites that offered positions for people half her age, she felt hope draining away like water from a broken cup. She had no way of knowing that across the city, in a gleaming office tower, someone was about to discover what had happened to her. Someone who remembered exactly what she'd mean to him 30 years ago. Someone with the power to turn her darkest moment into her greatest triumph. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like a herald of change, their sound growing louder as the aircraft circled Lincoln High School before descending onto the athletic field. Students pressed against classroom windows, teachers abandoned their lesson plans, and Principal Warren's smugness evaporated as he realized this wasn't a coincidence. Elijah Mason, now worth billions and one of America's most influential philanthropists, stepped from the helicopter with the bearing of someone accustomed to power but not corrupted by it. His silver hair caught the morning light, and his dark eyes scanning the crowd with focused intensity. Warren rushed forward, straightening his tie, suddenly aware he was about to meet one of the most powerful men in the country. Mr. Mason! What an honor! I'm Principal Warren. How can we— I'm looking for Helen Turner, Elijah said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. The crowd murmured. Whispers rippled through the gathered students and teachers. Why would Elijah Mason, reclusive billionaire, be looking for a recently fired teacher? She's no longer with our staff, Warren managed, his face paling. I know, Elijah replied, his tone ice-cold. That's why I'm here. He turned to face the crowd, and when he spoke next, his voice carried the weight of decades of gratitude and barely contained anger. I want to tell you about Helen Turner, he began. I was 17 years old when she saved my life. I was angry, poor, and on the fast track to nowhere. My father had abandoned our family. My mother worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I was failing every class, fighting in the hallways, and everyone except Mrs. Turner had written me off. The courtyard was dead silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She stayed after school, brought me food, helped me with homework, and most importantly, she believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. His voice cracked slightly. Because of her, I finished high school. Because of her, I went to college. Because of her, I built Mason Tech. Every success I've had, every life I've been able to change through my foundation, every dollar I've been able to give back. It all traces back to a teacher who refused to give up on one angry kid from the South Side. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to Warren. Inside this envelope is a certified check for $1 million. It's a donation to Lincoln High School with specific conditions. Warren's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Several teachers gasped audibly when they saw the amount. First, Elijah continued, your library will be renamed the Helen Turner Learning Center. Second, the Helen Turner Scholarship Fund will provide full college scholarships to students from underserved backgrounds. Third, this school will institute the Helen Turner Excellence in Teaching Award, honoring educators who go above and beyond for their students. He paused, his eyes finding Warren's face in the crowd. And fourth, Mrs. Turner will be invited back to speak to your staff about what real teaching looks like. Warren sputtered, Mr. Mason, if there's been a misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Elijah cut him off. You fired a woman who has touched thousands of lives. You threw away someone whose impact extends far beyond test scores and standardized metrics. You discarded a teacher whose influence built companies, shaped leaders, and changed the world in ways you'll never comprehend. He nodded to one of his assistants, who brought forward a microphone. Mrs. Turner, he said, his voice now carrying across the entire campus, if you're listening somewhere out there, know this. You were never just my teacher. You were my beginning. The world needs teachers like you, and I'm going to make sure it knows your name. The crowd erupted. Students cheered. Teachers wiped away tears. Even the janitor who'd watched Helen clean out her desk in shame now applauded with fervor. But the biggest shock was yet to come. 20 minutes later, a familiar figure walked through the school gates. Helen Turner herself, called by Elijah's assistant and driven to the school. She stood there, uncertain and overwhelmed, clutching her handbag with the same dignity she'd maintained through everything. Elijah walked to her, and as he did, the crowd saw in his face not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the 17-year-old boy whose life had been saved by a teacher's faith. I never forgot you, he said quietly, taking her hands, and now neither will anyone else. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds as if the universe itself was celebrating. Helen Turner, who had gone to bed the night before, wondering if her life had meaning, stood surrounded by hundreds of people, students, teachers, community members, all witnessing the power of one person's belief in another. This was more than redemption. This was recognition. This was justice delivered, with grace, power, and perfect timing. The months that followed transformed Helen's life in ways she could never have imagined. The Helen Turner Learning Center became not just a renamed library, but a state-of-the-art facility where struggling students received the kind of individual attention Helen had always provided. The scholarship fund grew with donations from Mason Tech, employees, former students of Helen's, and people inspired by her story. Helen found herself in an unexpected new role, not just as an educator, but as a symbol of teaching excellence. She spoke at conferences, consulted with school districts, and mentored young teachers. The woman who'd been discarded as outdated became the voice of a movement to bring meaning back to education. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. For the first time in years, Helen felt truly seen and valued. The validation came not just from external recognition, but from the deep satisfaction of knowing her life's work had mattered. Every late night she'd spent helping struggling students, every extra hour she'd invested in connecting with difficult kids, every small act of faith she'd shown, all of it had rippled forward in ways she couldn't have dreamed. Elijah offered her a position with his foundation, traveling the country to identify and support teachers who exemplified the principles she'd lived by. At an age when most people were slowing down, Helen found herself energized by new purpose. You know, she told Elijah over dinner one evening, a year after that dramatic morning at Lincoln High, there's something poetic about all this. You succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams, and instead of forgetting where you came from, you remembered. That says as much about you as anything you've built. He smiled. You taught me that success isn't just about what you achieve, it's about what you bring back to help others achieve. The Helen Turner Excellence in Teaching Award became one of the most prestigious honors in education, accompanied by a substantial monetary prize and national recognition. Recipients were teachers who, like Helen, saw beyond test scores to the human potential in every student. Lincoln High School, once a place where Helen had been unceremoniously dismissed, became a model for educational innovation balanced with personal connection. Principal Warren, chastened by the experience, began implementing programs that encouraged teachers to build deeper relationships with students. Helen's story spread beyond education circles. It became a reminder that everyone we meet might be fighting a battle we know nothing about, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness and belief can transform lives in ways we never imagine. On her 65th birthday, Helen received hundreds of cards from former students. Many shared stories of how her belief in them had changed their paths. A judge wrote about how her faith had kept him in school. A doctor credited her for helping her overcome a learning disability. A social worker thanked her for showing that everyone deserves dignity and respect. But the most meaningful gift came from Elijah, a framed photo from graduation day 31 years ago, showing a 17-year-old boy with hope in his eyes for the first time, standing next to his teacher. On the back he'd written, "For Helen Turner, who taught me that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. With eternal gratitude, Tommy." Tommy. That's what he'd asked her to call him in those early days when Elijah had seemed too formal, too distant. She'd forgotten until that moment how their relationship had begun with such simple intimacy, a teacher willing to see past a student's anger, and a student finally finding someone who cared. As Helen looked at the photo, tears blurred her vision. Not tears of sadness or loss, but of completion. Her circle was complete. The boy she'd saved had grown up to save her in return, and in doing so had reminded the world that teachers like her weren't relics of the past, but essential guardians of the future. The story of Helen Turner and Tommy Washington, Elijah Mason, became more than just a feel-good tale of a teacher and student. It became a movement. The Turner-Mason Foundation, established jointly by Helen and Elijah, created a network of schools prioritizing both academic excellence and personal connection. They developed training programs for educators, showing them how to identify and nurture potential in overlooked students. They funded research on the long-term impacts of teacher-student relationships. They created resources for teachers working with at-risk youth. Helen's quiet influence began to spread globally. Educational delegations came from other countries to study the Turner-Mason model. UNESCO invited her to speak about holistic education. She became a living example of how one person's dedication could create ripples that reached across generations and continents. At 70, Helen remained active and engaged, but she'd also found peace. She'd moved to a comfortable apartment overlooking the Chicago lakefront, filled with books, photos from decades of teaching, and mementos from students whose lives she'd touched. Dickens had passed on, but a new cat, aptly named Emerson, kept her company. Her friendship with Elijah had evolved into something profound, not just gratitude, but genuine mutual admiration. They spoke regularly, sharing ideas about education, society, and the responsibility that comes with influence. One rainy Thursday evening, exactly 5 years after that transformative morning at Lincoln High, Helen sat in her living room, grading essays from the teachers she now mentored. The rain drummed against her windows, reminding her of that dark night when she'd felt so alone and forgotten. Her phone rang. Elijah's name appeared on the screen. "Helen!" His voice was warm with excitement. "I have something to tell you, something wonderful." "What is it?" "The Turner-Mason Foundation has just been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for our work in education. But Helen, here's the thing. We're both receiving it, you and me, together." Helen sat in stunned silence. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. You deserve this more than anyone, Elijah continued. You've shown the world what teaching really means. The ceremony took place 3 months later. Helen, now 71, stood in the East Room of the White House beside Elijah as the president placed the medal around her neck. She thought of all the students she'd taught, all the lives she'd touched, all the moments when she'd wondered if her work mattered. As she listened to the citation, for a lifetime of dedication to education, for seeing potential where others saw problems, and for proving that one person's belief can change the world, Helen felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, complete peace with her life's work. After the ceremony, she and Elijah walked together in the White House gardens. The autumn air was crisp, and leaves danced around them in golden spirals. You know what the most beautiful part of all this is? Helen asked. What's that? It's not about the recognition or the awards. It's that somewhere right now there's a teacher staying late to help a struggling student. There's a principal seeing potential instead of problems. There's a boy or girl who might otherwise be forgotten, being seen and valued. Elijah nodded, understanding completely. You started a revolution with the simplest weapon of all, kindness. They walked in comfortable silence, teacher and student, linked forever by a bond that had transcended time, circumstances, and expectations. Years passed. Helen continued her work well into her 70s, always guided by the principle that had defined her career. Every child deserves someone who believes in them. She published a book, See Me, A Teacher's Guide to Finding the Light in Every Student, which became required reading in education programs worldwide. On a quiet spring morning, just after her 75th birthday, Helen received a call from Lincoln High School. Principal Warren had retired, and the new principal, a former student of Helen's from the early days, wanted to invite her for a special celebration. When Helen arrived at the school, she found the main hallway lined with photos, hundreds of them, showing students she'd taught over the decades. Each photo was accompanied by a brief note about what that person was doing now. Doctors, teachers, engineers, artists, social workers, small business owners, a tapestry of lives made richer by one teacher's faith. At the end of the hallway stood a life-sized bronze statue of a teacher and student working together over a book. The plaque read, Helen Turner. She saw stars where others saw shadows. Elijah was there, of course, along with dozens of her former students, now adults with children of their own. Many of them were teachers themselves, carrying forward the torch Helen had lit decades earlier. I want you to know something, Elijah said, standing to address the crowd. When I created Mason Tech, every employee handbook started with something Mrs. Turner taught me. Believe in people before they believe in themselves. That philosophy built my company. It guides our foundation. It shapes everything we do. He turned to Helen. You didn't just teach us math or literature or history. You taught us that we matter, that our lives have meaning, that no one is beyond hope. As Helen looked out at the faces surrounding her, students young and old, teachers inspired by her example, a community transformed by the ripple effects of caring, she felt the profound satisfaction of a life well lived. The celebration continued into the evening, with stories shared and memories treasured. As the day ended, Helen found herself alone for a moment in her old classroom, now beautifully updated, but still carrying the essence of what learning could be. She sat at the desk where she'd spent countless hours, her hand tracing the wood grain worn smooth by decades of use. Through the window, she could see students heading home, backpacks bouncing, futures full of possibility. Mrs. Turner. Voice at the door made her turn. A young teacher stood there, maybe 25, with bright eyes and nervous energy. Yes? I'm Ms. Rodriguez. I wanted to thank you. Really thank you. I have a student this year, Marcus. He reminds me of what I've read about Elijah Washington. Angry, struggling, convinced the world has given up on him. But because of your example, because of what you've shown is possible, I won't give up either. Helen smiled, feeling the circle expand once more. What does Marcus like to do? He draws, constantly. Incredible artwork, but he thinks it's stupid because his friends make fun of it. Never underestimate the power of art to change a life, Helen said, and never underestimate the power of one person who refuses to give up. Ms. Rodriguez smiled. Yes, ma'am, I won't. As the young teacher left, Helen felt the future stretching ahead, bright with possibility. Somewhere in that classroom next year, Ms. Rodriguez would see a spark in Marcus that others missed. Somewhere else, another teacher would remember Helen's story and believe in a difficult student. The cycle would continue, growing and spreading, touching lives in ways no one could fully measure. Helen gathered her things and walked slowly out of the school. At the gate, Elijah waited in his car, ready to drive her home. "How does it feel?" he asked, as they drove through the streets of Chicago, past neighborhoods where his company had built community centers, past schools supported by their foundation. "Like completion," Helen said, "like understanding finally that the smallest kindnesses create the biggest changes." They drove in comfortable silence, the evening light soft on the city they'd both called home. As they passed a school where children were playing in the yard, Helen saw a teacher kneeling next to a crying child, offering comfort and understanding. "There," she whispered, "right there. That's how it starts." Elijah nodded, understanding. They'd both learned that the most important work happens in the small moments. One conversation, one act of faith, one person refusing to give up on another. Helen Turner died peacefully in her sleep at age 82, surrounded by the books she'd treasured, the awards that honored her work, and the countless letters from students whose lives she'd touched. Her memorial service filled Chicago's largest cathedral, with overflow crowds watching on screens outside. Teachers came from across the country. Former students flew in from every continent. Elijah Mason, now in his 70s himself, delivered a eulogy that broadcast worldwide, sharing the story of how one teacher's belief had not only transformed his life, but had ripple effects that changed the world. She didn't see herself as a hero, he said. She saw herself as a teacher. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the greatest heroes are those who show up every day, believing in people who haven't learned to believe in themselves yet. The Turner Mason Foundation continued to grow, now supporting millions of students globally. In schools around the world, the Helen Turner Award recognized educators who showed extraordinary dedication to their students. Her book became a classic, translated into dozens of languages, inspiring teachers across cultures and generations. But perhaps her greatest legacy wasn't in the awards or foundations or statues erected in her honor. It was in the countless, small moments of connection still happening every day. Teachers staying late to help struggling students, educators seeing potential where others saw problems, young people discovering that someone believed in them. Years later, sociologists studying educational impact would identify what they called the Turner effect, the exponential impact of teachers who create deep connections with students. They tracked how Helen's direct influence on hundreds of students had multiplied through their children, their own teaching careers, their community involvement, creating a web of positive change that touched millions of lives. On the 10th anniversary of Helen's passing, Lincoln High School unveiled a new program called Be the Teacher Turner Was to You. It challenged educators to identify students who needed extra support and to provide it with the same dedication Helen had shown. Elijah Mason, now Chairman Emeritus of Mason Tech, spent his days working full-time with the foundation. He often visited schools, sharing Helen's story, reminding educators that they held the power to change lives. "She saw me," he would tell them. "When I was 17 and angry and everyone had given up on me, she saw me. She saw past the attitude, past the circumstances, past the easy labels, and she saw potential. That simple act of seeing, really seeing, changed everything." In classrooms around the world, teachers faced their own Elijah students. Kids society had written off, young people struggling against odds that seemed impossible to overcome. And increasingly, those teachers remembered Helen Turner's story. They remembered that the angry student, the struggling learner, the kid everyone else ignored, might just need someone to see them. Some of those students became teachers themselves, carrying forward the torch of caring. Others became doctors, artists, parents, volunteers, people who'd learned through Helen's example that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and belief in their potential. The ripples continued to spread as ripples do, touching shores no one could have imagined, when Helen first decided to stay late one afternoon to help an angry boy named Tommy Washington learn to read. On the marble wall of the Turner Mason Foundation headquarters in Chicago, visitors could read these words, Helen's own philosophy carved in stone. See the light in every child. Believe in them before they believe in themselves. Stay late. Show up early. Never give up. Love your work more than your comfort. Remember that you may be the only person who believes in them today, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. Below those words, in smaller text, was a simple truth. Every child is someone's miracle waiting to happen. And in classrooms everywhere, teachers opened their doors each morning, carrying that truth with them, ready to see the light in every student who walked through, ready to be for some struggling child what Helen Turner had been for Elijah Mason, the person who refused to give up, the person who saw potential where 1 KB left.